Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to NCI Live. My name is David Groth, and I'm a technical solutions specialist at Network Center. And today we're going to be talking about MFA, what that means, what it looks like, and tools to help you, businesses get there. Joining me today is John Ryan. John Ryan is also a technical solutions specialist here at NCI. And we're going to be talking today about that. And we wanted to make a note here, whether you're tuning in with us on YouTube or LinkedIn, please chat us your questions and we'll do our best to answer them live here. Also, please try to like us and subscribe with us, and so you can be notified on upcoming topics. With that, welcome, John. How you doing today?
Hey, David. Good.
Good.
Ready to talk MFA.
Awesome. So, MFA, what exactly is it? How do we use it?
So MFA stands for multi-factor authentication, or a lot of people call it two-factor authentication. But basically what it is, it's a way to know if the person who's logging into a service, a piece of application, a system, online, any of that stuff, to find out if that's actually the person logging in. It's a way to authenticate using two forms of authentication, whether it's password and a text, or some way to make sure that the person who's using the password is the actual person accessing whatever location or service or application that they're using.
So basically another layer of security when you're trying to log in. Would you say
Right.
it's basically, would you say that it's a way of, I don't want to say preventing, but making it more difficult for people to say just using, say, stealing a password?
Yeah, it's put in place to help with password compromise. So let's say your password were to get hijacked, stolen, through a keylogger, or through a website, or maybe you had an email where you actually were asked to provide a password, and you clicked on it and you put the password in, and they somehow stole it from you. It's a way to make sure that if any third party or bad actors using that password can't get into the system without it actually being you.
Excellent. So what kind of things would actually kick off MFA? Because I do notice, like, I've used MFA before on, like, my bank, right? Like when I log into my online banking, I have my username and my password, but then a lot of times I'll have it'll send me a text, right, saying, okay, please put in this code, right? So what kinds of things would trigger MFA on, like, say, a company network? Would it be every time, or what kinds of things would trigger MFA?
Sure. So usually that's the question that we ask, is what do you want it to be triggered by? So do you want it to be triggered every time you go to your 365 environment, if you're working in Office 365 or Microsoft 365? Do you want it to prompt you when you're VPNing into the network through the firewall? So if you're a remote user and you're trying to remote in, do we want to authenticate those users with a second layer of authentication? Are you opening up an application that your company uses, like ERP type of application, and you want to make sure that the person using that, maybe it's a hosted one, you want to make sure that that's the actual user that's accessing that. So it can be triggered by many different things. You can set up a lease time for it. So one of the big complaints that you might see from end users is, I don't want to be having to reference my phone or put in this second, form of authentication every day or every couple of hours, or whatever you have it set up for. You can set up a lease on it, basically meaning that let's say it prompts you today and you set up the lease for 24 hours for that action or activity or login, you won't get prompted for another 24 hours. We have customers that set it up longer than that. I think the generalized, I guess, idea is maybe set it up for 24 hours, so that the expectation is that every time you come into work, you're probably going to get prompted for it at least one time. One thing I think we should talk about is there is a difference between using MFA for VPN or for 365. We're not talking about desktop authentication. That's a whole different story. A lot of people are maybe unsure about, am I going to have to do this every time I log into my PC? That's desktop authentication. That's a different type of authentication.
Yep.
The assumption is that if you're sitting at your computer and you're opening Outlook, that you're the actual user of that computer, and that goes into a deeper level of physical, like site security and device security. So,
And there's a lot of
if you
moving
have somebody
pieces.
that,
There's a lot of moving pieces.
yeah, if you have somebody that travels a lot, that might be taking their machine to conferences or working from internet cafes or whatever they happen to be doing, then you might want to put some desktop authentication on there because that device is kind of, exposed.
But that brings up a good point, though. So, is MFA something that is useful in a hybrid work environment where you have people that are logging in locally, but as well they're logging in remotely, right? They're logging in from any number of locations.
Yeah, and sometimes it has to do with where the information is stored. So like if you have Microsoft 365, that's a cloud-based application. You don't have to be on site to access that. So if you have that out in the cloud, it's essentially only protected by a single password. Well, if you have a password compromise, then anybody in the world that can get to that, login essentially can get to everything that you can get to. So that's where protecting it by more than just a single password and having MFA on there will actually help, with authenticating the actual user.
Sure. So let's take it back a little higher level. Why is MFA so important? Why are you hearing it more and more and more in not only you hear it on the news somewhat, but more and more we hear it in the corporate networking, enterprise networking, what have you. We hear it constantly. Why is it so important?
Yep. So cyber attacks are much more common these days than they ever have been. Data security, breaching. You hear about breaches all the time. We see it, with companies that are going through events that they have. With a mobile workforce, it gets harder and harder to secure your data as it's being accessed outside of your company. So one of the easiest ways to kind of ensure that data is getting in the right hands is to use MFA to authenticate those users. So when we talk about MFA and we talk about the triggers of MFA, you have to think of who are the people accessing it and who are the potential people trying to access it that are not your employees.
Right.
So if somebody is trying to get into your system and they're trying to maybe get in through your VPN, that's a direct access to your corporate network from the outside. So you'd want to secure that. So MFA for your VPNs or your virtual private networks through your firewalls is a good thing to secure. Microsoft 365, that's your data in a hosted environment on the internet protected by a single password. Turning on MFA for that would also help protect that potentially exposed data.
Certainly. So switching gears here, I'm gonna jump to this then. So it's important for those reasons. I think we need to say at least, what does MFA look like? We've talked about in theory what it is, but what does it look like for somebody who's actually using it? I mean, you've got a password. We all know how to log in with a password. But what is the other component, the multi-factor? What is that part of it?
Sure, that can be several different things. You usually have a few different options. If your end users all have cell phones, you can have it do the traditional text to the cell phone option. If you're using Duo or the Microsoft Authenticator, there's applications that you can also load onto your smart device, like your cell phone, and you can open up that application and approve that authentication through there. If you don't have any kind of requirements for bring your own device or are not providing cell phones, you can actually set it up to call a desk phone. So if you have users that sit at their office and you want to authenticate that way, they can just answer the phone, type in the code, you're all set to go. That's also helpful if you have shared computers where you're not tying it to a specific login. Everybody has different logins, but you can also MFA to a local telephone for that. There's also tokens or fobs that you can use for desktop authentication,
Mm-hmm.
or even access to applications, that you push a button on it and it gives you a code, and then you type in that code and it allows you access for that.
Excellent. So there's definitely multiple multi-factor options. That's great.
Yep.
So what types of things is MFA going to protect us against? I mean, you've said cyber type attacks, but what diving a little deeper into that, what kinds of things would it protect us against?
Yeah, so there's kind of been two big drivers on this. One of the drivers is the insurance requirements for cyber insurance. So we have a lot of customers that have cyber insurance, but are now getting prompted from their cyber insurance providers to enable MFA. So you can see how MFA is kind of recognized by the insurance community for a legitimate extra step for protection.
Mm-hmm.
And previously, before MFA became kind of popular or readily available, you could do it through certain devices, and you had certain options with MFA. But a lot of times, what IT professionals were doing is making end users reset their password more frequently,
Mm-hmm.
or making the passwords longer, so that people who are trying to decode the password, it would take them, 300 years to do it, or whatever the equation is for that. So,
Mm-hmm.
but it's still a password,
Right.
and it's still able to be compromised by it just leaking.
Right.
So,
And if it gets too complicated, eventually you get back to what I call the sticky note on the desktop situation, and that's no security. So,
right.
yep.
Or having it in with your laptop, and then your laptop getting stolen.
Right.
So with MFA, you can still keep your same password complexity and reset uh, parameters, as far as like every 3 months or however often you want to make end users reset their password. But you just add this MFA on top of it, and it's kind of takes care of the second authentication for you, as far as distributing it to your end users.
Excellent. Excellent. Um, okay. So what other items have we types of seen that besides we have the user experience, but what other things are protected with MFA?
So you can protect applications, a lot of third-party applications that have maybe gone to a hosted offering. So you no longer have it in a data center or hosted within your own environment, but it's hosted, let's say, through Sage or somebody like that that has like a hosting, or QuickBooks Online, or somebody that has an online version
Mm.
of an application that you normally housed on site, but has moved to the cloud. A lot of those companies also offer turning on MFA for it.
Mhm.
And if they don't, there's other ways that you can do it through Duo, where they're actually compatible with those online services to be able to enable your own Duo. So
Sure.
if you ask your ERP or your third-party application that's hosted in the cloud, if they support Duo and they don't, you can implement your own Duo within it.
Okay. So what about okay, so that's basically user facing stuff. What about security that is more for like devices? Can we MFA devices and like hardware stuff?
Sure. So another, you know, I guess uh, type of MFA that you can use is for administrative users. So basically, if you have network administrators that have login access to your servers, to your switches, even to your desktops, your endpoints, and they have administrator access to all of those devices, we can enable MFA just for the administrator access
Mm.
to those devices. So it
Mm.
would be a login type of MFA for logging into a switch, or logging into a server, or logging into a desktop. And in those cases, you don't have to buy a license for every end user. You only need it for the administrators. And that's one of the things that the insurance companies are also asking for, is anybody with the administrative access to those devices to be able to be MFA'd as well.
Specifically, yeah. So like if you're accessing a firewall, and that makes total sense, right? So if you're going to do uh, like you're going to administrate any of these devices, and especially I would think it would be true of a firewall because that's protecting the entire company's network.
First level of security.
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly, and then server level as well. So that makes complete sense. So, okay, so what if we're going to implement it? Let's say I'm an IT administrator. What kinds of things would need to be implemented to? If I have no MFA on my network, I have no MFA in my entire IT infrastructure. What kinds of things would I need to have in place to implement an MFA type infrastructure?
Sure. So I guess when we talk about it, we usually talk about kind of three different levels of MFA. The first level would be any kind of hosted mail services or hosted cloud services. So usually we target Office 365, and within Office 365, they offer MFA services
Mm,
for just that environment.
yep.
So typically it's included in your license for your users. So you can go in and you can enable it. You can set up the lease, and you can set up, the type of authentication that you allow. So, and that's usually that phone call, the text, or the Authenticator app.
Mm,
So that's all hosted within the Microsoft kind of suite of services. The next level of to do that and to add VPN access through your firewall. So basically, now you have a lot of end users, especially in these days, working from home, but are accessing services on site. So the next step would be, do the 365, but then also, through your firewall, depending upon what it'll support, turning on multi-factor authentication through that. So now when you have end users sitting at home, trying to remote into your network, turning on multi-factor authentication. There's a couple different ways to do that. You can do it with Duo, depending upon what your firewall supports, or you can actually do it with the Microsoft Authenticator as well to try to keep the experience the same throughout all the
mm,
platforms. The third thing
sure.
that we can talk about is what we talked about, the administrator level of access. Um, that right now requires more of like a Duo type of authentication, and that's something that you would be licensed through Duo with a cloud license for Duo. So you'd be able to administer that
Mm.
throughout your network devices, your server devices, and be able to access that in a cloud portal, which would allow you to set adjustments and use Active Directory authentication as well.
I'm just going to interject here real quick, and for those people that are watching and listening, please don't be shy about putting your questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring. We'll do our best to answer them and bring them up if we can. So just wanted to re-announce that. So is it the? I'm just going to throw this back to John. Is there? It, can you? We've mentioned a couple of different products there. Can you have more than one MFA provider? Or does it have to all be one provider that talks to everything?
It all depends upon what you want the user experience to be
Mm-hmm.
and what the licensing is. So, if you do have to add licensing, like through 365 in order to enable your VPN access, there's an additional license that's required for that. And if it's going to be for all of your end users, instead of doing that, you could switch to just using Duo or, that type of application to have the user experience be just one format basically.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're only going to do authentication through like an application like Duo for your administrators, the administrators or your IT professionals in your company are going to be more tolerable of having multiple different types of authentications. And
Yep.
really the experience is close. It's a different application if you use two different types of providers, but like a text message or a phone call is the same.
Mm-hmm.
You're not really going to know a difference between the two. But the big part is trying to make this as painless as possible for your end users, and staying in one format is probably the least painful for the experience.
Mhm.
So if you can, and it makes sense on the licensing side of it, it's definitely worth doing. But on that side of it, if all you're doing is authenticating your 365 users, that's essentially a license that already comes with it, or a free service that already comes with your current licensing. So you don't want to have to buy a duo license or something for all of your end users if you don't have to, you know.
Right. So you mentioned two different types. You've mentioned the 365 MFA, and then you've mentioned Duo. I want to dive into one little aspect that you and I have, talked several times about MFA, and one of the things being the difference between the basic MFA, should we call it, and then the more advanced Azure MFA. You want to talk? Can you just talk real briefly about those differences in those two, like the one that comes with the license versus the one where you have to either buy an extra license or you have to have a more advanced Microsoft license
Sure.
to get it.
Yeah, and what we call that is conditional access. And
Mm-hmm.
conditional access is basically, uh, can I turn off MFA for end users that are on my network?
Mm-hmm.
So people who are in the office working, can I make them not get, prompted for that multi-factor authentication
Right.
because they're physically in, my building, kind of like the Outlook thing, right?
Right.
So
Yep.
if you open Outlook and you go to your email, even if you're at home, there's an assumption that when you're opening your email that you're actually using your PC. So by default, that MFA is turned off. Now, if you're going to go to like a SharePoint share or OneDrive or any of that kind of stuff, you're going to get prompted for the multi-factor authentication because now you're accessing files on that cloud.
Mm-hmm.
But for a basic user just opening up Outlook, you're going to be able to just start using Outlook without getting prompted for it. Conditional access is the same way with people that are with inside your network or on a certain IP range. Um, you can turn it on and off so that it behaves differently depending upon the location of the user and what they're accessing.
Right. So it's kind of allows for a certain balance of an assumption of trust under some condition, right? Like if they're coming from a specific address or specific network location, we can relax the restrictions on MFA versus if they're out in the wild, out on the internet, it's tightest MFA restriction possible, zero trust, everything.
Yep,
So,
yep,
yep.
absolutely.
Okay. So want to get down to what recommendations would you give a company that's going to give uh, to set up MFA? What would you say is the basic, like
Sure.
just the most basic MFA that they should have?
Yep. If you don't have any cyber security insurance requirements and you just want to be more, secure with your data and with your end users, I would target those cloud accessible applications or services. That would be the first one that I would do. And the easy target on that is 365. So if you're not currently doing any MFA and you're working in 365, I would say that's the easiest to turn on. And it's the easiest way to secure your data that's currently remotely accessible by a single password. That would be the one that I would target first, and that's going to be the lowest dollar one to do. And it's on all of the cyber insurance applications, even if you're not using cyber insurance. So it's number one on there, so you know that that's
Yeah.
one that's kind of universally recognized.
Almost all of those pages that we see coming across our desk when we're asked to put together solutions and what have you, they almost all have the exact same MFA requirements down. Like it's almost like they went to an insurance seminar and photocopied it because they
Yep.
literally MFA is the number one thing. Boom, boom, boom. So yeah, and to build off what you said, the MFA piece is not just pervasive throughout, our personal lives and our company lives, but it's to the point where every, internet company, every website, everything that allows you to log in, it's just a natural, like they're either requiring it for the more secure sites like banks, or they're saying, "Hey, this is a really good idea. You really should do it. And if you don't want to do it, we're making you either sign or acknowledge or say something that like, yeah, you know that this is a problem and we're not liable," kind of a thing. So,
Yep, and it's kind of a change of mindset too, because I've even asked some, businesses, and they said, well, we don't have any customers that remotely log into our services or our systems.
absolutely.
Well, you don't, but you do have internal employees that do. So they're susceptible to password compromise and attacks and bad actors just as much as, external people are. So
Certainly.
I would say also putting other security pieces in place for your end users that are off of your network. So like a good antivirus, something that's maybe an intrusion detector, a web filter, a spam filter, all of that kind of stuff is important too. To keep those bad guys away from asking for the password,
Right.
which can be just as easy as an email that looks like it's from eBay or something, for you to go out and change your password. Well, you happen to use your same password for eBay as you use for your corporate account. So
Right.
stuff like that, to kind of just secure those people that are, it's kind of scary once people get away, outside of your walls, to make sure that they're just as protected as they are, if they're inside your walls.
Certainly. Well, that's great. I'm going to go ahead and we've talked about quite a few topics with MFA, and I know there's a lot more we can get into, and we've really just scratched the surface and got at the top level. I'm going to go ahead and kind of just really make another appeal to the people that are watching to please send us in some questions. I did receive an email question from somebody who had my email address, and they asked a very important question. We just barely scratched it, but I think we can dive a little more into it. But please remember, everyone, go ahead and just put your questions in the chat, and we'll get right to them. The question that I got was, should desktops or laptops require MFA? Not just using it, but when we authenticate, we talked about that. But should they require it to make it like next level secure? What do you think?
Yeah, and that has to do with what applications, what access the end users have from their desktop, what kind of security access you have within your building.
Sure.
So if it's easy for somebody just to walk in, let's say you have kiosks or any of that kind of stuff, or hoteling locations where you provide PCs. That multi-factor authentication for desktop login is going to be more important for those kind of customers or those kind of users, as opposed to, if you have key card locked doors, security in order to get in and sit down in front of your machine. I would also say that if you have a lot of mobility, if you have people that are using laptops, taking them with, going to conferences, doing all of that kind of stuff, that's where it's going to be more advantageous for you to have some desktop authentication.
Or have their laptop stolen like I did.
Yeah, or have their laptop stolen like you did.
Yeah.
So there's different ways with that too. You can do, you can do the thumbprint readers. You can enable that. Microsoft has a thing called Windows Hello, where they have a bunch of different options for you, as far as even just doing the, the tracing on the screen, facial recognition, all of that kind of stuff can be built into the desktop authentication.
That brings up a really good question. Another question I'm going to have, we haven't received any additional questions. What would you say in the ones that, in the experience you have, and I can add my 2 cents here too, but what is the most common second factor that you've seen? What do you think the most common factor is?
For regular MFA or for desktop MFA?
Both. Give me both. What do you think?
Both. Desktop MFA, I've seen Smart Card and Fob are kind of the two top ones that I have seen. They do have one that's it's a USB stick that you just kind of put in a USB port, and that kind of unlocks it too.
Sure.
That one's a little bit more difficult these days because a lot of the new laptops, they don't have full-size USB ports. And then the other thing would be the external MFA, or just the regular MFA, if you want to call it that. I would say the most common is the text, and the easiest to deploy is probably the text, just because you essentially just have to have a phone number for that end user. And when we set that up, you can either manually add those people to a list, to an access list, or you can sync it with Active Directory.
Right.
And within Active Directory, you usually have to do some cleanup and make sure that, phone numbers and stuff are included in those user accounts.
Certainly. We did get a question from Sarah. Actually, and I have two questions here. One from Sarah, one from Mark. The first one is MFA a good fit for smaller MSPs, or is it a better fit for larger enterprise businesses? That's question number one. And question from Mark, is Duo or similar the best way to handle on-prem Active Directory MFA? So first one is MFA, good fit for smaller MSPs or better for enterprise businesses?
I think it doesn't matter whether you're a small business or a large business for MFA.
I would agree.
It's basically how you log in.
Or one person.
Yeah, or one person. If I could turn on MFA for my home PC, I would turn it on. So I think it's just another level of security for any size organization. Now it'll be cheaper to deploy for smaller locations, or smaller operations than it will be for 200 user offices. And that really depends on how you deploy it and what your requirements are for your security. But yeah, I would say it doesn't matter what size business you have.
And then the question from Mark, is Duo or similar the best way to handle on-prem Active Directory MFA?
So if you're doing a control delete type of login to a desktop, to a server, any of that kind of stuff, you can use Duo or similar, which is a hosted platform. It's a little bit easier to deploy. You can, however, do like a Microsoft Authenticator or something, but you do have to build a policy server on site.
Yep.
So there's a little bit more that goes into the actual design of it, because you're kind of hosting those services and the access rights and all of that kind of stuff through a server versus just doing it through a cloud platform. So sometimes the cloud platform is a little easier to deploy just because all of that is already built up and you're just, essentially just enabling the cloud connection to it.
There are benefits and drawbacks. In my experience, there's been benefits and drawbacks to each platform. The one thing I like about Duo versus Microsoft, and we're talking about those as they're the only two platforms, but they're the 500-pound gorillas, right? Cisco and Microsoft. Cisco, Duo, Microsoft. My personal experience has been that Cisco Duo has plugins for a lot of different platforms, and they actually talk to Microsoft, right? So just personal experiences that you can plug in different authenticators for different platforms, like you mentioned Sage, and there's different other ERP systems that they have plugins for doing that kind of authentication. But you have the Duo app, and you can authenticate right there. I've gone to other, logged into some website, and they say you must have the Duo authenticator. Well, I've already got it, so.
Yeah, another thing too is it depends upon what kind of company you have or what kind of business you do. We also work with hospitals where, we've all been there. You're sitting in the, in the hospital room waiting for the nurse to come in, and the nurse or doctor comes in and they pull out a smart card and they swipe it on the machine, and it unlocks the machine for them to use.
Right.
And that's that will actually change what they can get to based on their security level. So that'll show them different things on the desktop that they can get to that maybe, a lower end user can't get to. And that's through a completely different type of service like Imprivata or, a different supplier that kind of caters to that specific type of business. So really sitting down and figuring out what parameters you have, what kind of access levels you need on a desktop level will kind of point you towards what kind of solution that you use.
And just dividing out the requirements, right? Like listing them all out and going, okay, there's going to be one that's going to be a better fit than another. Well, John, we've kind of come to the end of our time together today. It's been great having you on. I really appreciate all your expertise and your time. So thanks very much. And everyone out there that's been watching, please feel free to visit us on all of our social media, and you can email us at info@netcenter.net, as well as reaching us on our YouTube and LinkedIn sites. Please come back and visit us every 2 weeks. We'll have our next show in 2 weeks. We'll also be doing various content on our YouTube channel. So But as always, thanks for visiting us on NCI Live.